Well, good afternoon, everyone. The next panel is a discussion on the relationship between our growing understanding of neuroplasticity and our public education system, and really the development of each child into a successful adult. If you really think of public education, it was designed to close the achievement gap and provide everybody the ability to succeed in life. And yet, if you look at the data we have in academic results and achievement, there are significant shortfalls, particularly with people of color or people born in poverty. And the policy approach to solving this was more resources into schools, better prepared teachers, new curriculums such as Common Core, and other efforts, and yet the results have been marginal at best. So the effort was in resourcing schools, but it was never per se looking at building capacity in the student, particularly in their brain. So just quickly, and why, again, I think this is one of the, in my mind, the compelling patterns, because we're talking about how to apply our understanding of the brain in a way that gives people capacity and do it in a scaled way within school systems. If you look at development tracks of children, and you look at the early education influences, environment matters. It really matters. And if you grow up in poverty, you can suffer from one or two conditions: a lack of enrichment or an excess of anxiety and chronic stress. Both have implications on the development of the brain. And when a child finally gets to school, their brain is not ready to learn. So what's exciting about this panel is that each of our panelists has begun to address this gap by bringing their knowledge of neuroscience into programs that are now being, if not available in schools, are being developed for early childhood use in the home, where we position the parent as the first grade teacher of their child. So let me do introductions, and I'll tell you how we're going to set up the panel. And then once each of our presenters has taken 5 to 6 minutes to present their body of work in schools, we'll have a conversation about the work. So Bruce Wexler, Professor Emeritus at Yale, a neuroscientist, and began to kind of validate neuroplasticity. You were one of the early people that neurons that fire together, wire together, right? Right. I like to simplify things, but that is essentially what, once he began to learn that, he began to learn, well, how do you use neuroplasticity to make a person function better by getting their neural circuits to begin to integrate and regulate better. And out of that, he created a game called Activate, which he's going to tell us about, which is a cognitive training a program used in schools to fortify executive function and the attentional mechanisms in our brain, which, if that works better, you're going to make better choices, and you're going to have the mechanism to learn. He's going to tell us about the design of the program and how he's introducing it to schools. Susan you always have like at least 2 appointments at Hopkins. I don't know if you have that now. And she's kind of this Renaissance woman. I've known Susan for a long time. And she is both rigorous in her academic thinking, but also you're a very creative person. And out of this came this idea 6 or 7 years ago that she could create an early education platform that would engage the child with online activities, but then at the end of a session, the system would report to a parent what the child had learned, and she would give an offline way to reinforce the learning. It's absolutely brilliant and so pragmatic, but all built on her understanding of the importance of enrichment and engagement as early in the life of a child as possible. That creates a growth mindset in the child to be curious about the world around him or her. Thank you for being here. And then Kimberly McNatt is the Executive Director of the Hawn Foundation. How many of you have heard of Goldie Hawn? Right? Everybody's heard of Goldie Hawn, right? And you think of Goldie because when she's in character in some of her movies and early television shows, she's kind of this, I apologize for this, kind of a ditzy blonde, right? That was her kind of stage presence.
Let's just make sure that quote's attributed to you.
It is, yeah. And what I'm going to say now is the more important thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
But when you meet Goldie, she is one of the most intelligent, focused, conceptually powerful persons that has a mission to bring mindfulness as a social, emotional platform for well-being to all children around the world. All right? So if you have a vision that big, if you're really smart, you get an executive director that can deliver on the vision, right? And that's Kimberly, because I have looked at a lot of programs that are offered in schools, and often they fail because they don't understand the culture of schools, the demands put on teachers, other aspects that will accelerate adoption, and they fall apart, frankly. Kimberly went and observed the public education and figured out how to make teachers embrace this. And I think when we talk about adoption of any of the neural technologies or other things that we've explored in the last 2 days, there is an art to getting people to want to embrace these and use it properly. I think you've done this with your program. That's one of the things we hope you'll talk about as a best practice. So what we're going to do is Bruce is going to lead off, and he's going to give us Neuroplasticity 101 that will lead into his discussion, and then we'll go down the row, and then we'll have questions from you, and I have a few questions we'll ask our panelists.
Okay, thank you, John. Well, as you know by now, there are 100 billion neurons in the human brain, each one directly connected to 1,000 others, and each one receives 100 inputs or messages just in 1,000th of a second. But how does it work in terms of thinking, feeling, things that we're all interested here? The important point is that thinking processes are not properties of single cells in the brain, and they're not properties of even a single region in the brain. They emerge from the integrated action of hundreds of thousands or millions of cells distributed throughout the brain in dynamically reconfiguring neural systems. So the next question is, what creates the connections, as you see here, between two neurons? What creates the connections that create these neural systems? And the important answer is that these connections are not determined by our genes at birth. Instead, they're shaped after birth by environmental input. Hubel and Wexler won the Nobel Prize for demonstrating the degree to which our brains are shaped after birth in both structure and function. As John said, neurons that fire together, wire together. There are many demonstrations of this in the research literature. Here's just one. What happens to your brain if you practice a violin for many years as a child? Now the pointer, I don't have a pointer that can show this to you, but if you look at the top panel there, the brain on the upper row, and you looked at the left-hand side, that's controlling the right hand. And in a violin player, the right hand makes relatively simple repetitive movements. And you can see the volume of the sensory motor cortex there. Now, if you look at the other side, the right side of the brain, that's controlling the left hand, which is making many fancy fingering movements. And you can see with a naked eye a volume expansion in that part of the brain because of the activity-dependent enhancement and recruitment of neural resources. In the bottom row, you see the brain of a piano player, and they have two of these buffed up motor cortices because they're using both hands in many fine motor movements. So scientists have started to try to harness this neuroplasticity for therapeutic purposes. And many examples of that, but this is a particularly dramatic one, I think. It enables blind people to see with their tongues. So the individual wears camera like spectacles. The camera sends electrical impulses to a little piece of metal that's put on their tongue, like a TV screen, a little point of stimulation representing each point in the environment. And the brain doesn't care if it's getting electrical signals from the eyes or if it's getting electrical signals from the tongue. That doesn't matter. If these electrical signals have a correspondence to the outside world, the brain will organize and use that information for seeing. So here you see a picture of a blind man doing rock climbing, and he can reach out and he knows where to find things. Any of us could train with this device in 5 hours and be able to tell on a reading chart whether you're looking at an E in this orientation or that orientation through our tongues. So our goals were to try and harness this neuroplasticity for educational purposes. We wanted to improve executive functions, so a suite of cognitive operations that include sustained attention, cognitive flexibility, response inhibition, working memory, train those, and therefore improve learning abilities. Content-independent pedagogy to directly improve thinking itself, abilities, as John said. So what does our program consist of? I'm not able to go into much detail because of the time. Maybe later in the conversation we can, but basically, we have computer-presented brain exercises that engage and produce the activity-dependent enhancement of the target neural systems that support the executive functions. And we also have physical exercises. Physical exercise by itself increases neuroplasticity, it increases educational achievement. But we design physical exercises that have cognitive components, so they engage the same neural systems as do our computer programs, but now in the context of whole body activity and social interaction. I'm going to show you some data from schools. We are implementing this in school settings. Schools are the biggest provider of mental health services for children in the country. And they have children there for many hours, as you know, and that's harnessing neuroplasticity through education. So what you can see here, this is a test of working memory from the NIH toolbox of tests, which we built into the program itself. So we give that early in the training and then afterwards when they've done the training. And these are 1,200 children in one school system, kindergarten, first and second grade. So the kindergarten is in red, first grade is in blue, second grade is in green. And if you look at the pre part, that's before they did our program, what's important to notice is that kindergarten children are the lowest performers in this working memory test, then first grade, and then second grade. So that tells us our tests are valid in the classroom, but they also tell us we are targeting or evaluating a neural and cognitive process that develops during these years, because you can see it's going from kindergarten, first to second grade. Now you look after the program. So there are highly significant gains in 4 months in all grade levels. And if you look where the kindergarten kids end up, they're well above where the first grade kids start, and the first grade kids end up well above where the second grade kids start. So they have gained over a year of intellectual competence in 4 months. But how does that translate into actual learning then? So here we turn to math and reading achievement tests given by the schools themselves. I'm going to show you 3 or 4 slides, all the same format, so let me explain the format. This is a test given by the Pearson Education Company. Green says what proportion of kids are meeting standards. Yellow means what proportion of kids are just below standards, and red means what proportion of children are in big trouble. And this is a third grade class, 95% of the kids get free lunch. It's a big poverty area. Those kids don't get the stimulation they need before they get to school to develop these neurocognitive systems. For them, I call our program a school lunch program for the brain. And what you see on the left two bars are the district-wide scores in the beginning of the year and the end of the year. On the right side, you see the one class that the principal decided they want to try our program in the same time period. And you can see a dramatic increase so that this poverty area school is dramatically outperforming the whole district after doing our program. This particular test of reading in the third grade has high predictive power of whether you're going to graduate from high school. Whoop. Did I hit the wrong button? Can I reverse that? Or can you reverse that for me? Thank you. So this was another school in that same city. It was a first grade class, and this was their math achievement tests. Here on the left you see district-wide, In the middle, you see another class in the same school that did not get our program. And the right-hand side, you see the really off-the-wall dramatic improvement in the class that got our program. And here, math achievement, a whole different city, second grade this time, same picture. Now, the last thing I'm going to mention now is results we've had in a randomized controlled trial with ADHD. I didn't put that here first because this is a focus on education, but yesterday and earlier today, there was a lot of interest in programs like this for ADHD. And of course, inside the school setting, many of the children are having problems, have them because of attention problems. So what you can see here is that we have children who get the program for 4 months, 16 weeks after school, 3 or 4 times a week. Then you see kids who are just continuing with their life as usual. And then in the second half of the year, they switch over. So every child has a period when they're doing the program and when they're not doing the program. And these scores are parent ratings of their ADHD symptoms. And while the children were in the program, they were twice as likely to show a 30% decrease in symptoms. 30% decrease in symptoms is the average decrease you get with a medication in most of the medication studies. So these kids were reaching the level with this non-medication intervention of the average gain from medication, twice as likely to get that gain when they had the program than when they didn't. Now, parent ratings are wonderful in one sense because they see the kids in many situations. And ADHD manifestations are context dependent, so it's very important to evaluate them in many settings. But scientists often don't believe parent ratings. And they do have a problem from a scientific point of view because the parents are not blind, so they know whether their child was getting the program or not. So what we did, since we have built into our programs these objective tests of response inhibition, attention, and memory, we were able to say, well, let's look at the kids whose parents said they got better and the kids who said their parents didn't get better and see what happened to their actual cognition. And there we see that only the children whose parents said they got better showed cognitive gains. And I have 2 of the tests here, but they actually showed highly significant gains in all 3 tests. And the kids whose parents said they did not get better from our program showed no gains on any test. So conclusion is parents were right. They knew which of their children got better and which didn't. And not only did those children get better from our program in their symptoms, but they also got better in the core cognitive operations that we know to be central to the impairments of kids with ADHD. Thank you. How much time did I take?
I'm just, John, just so I know, I'm just these is.
You're asking the wrong.
message
Yeah,
is
that's
wrong
right,
way.
the
This is
arrows.
just left, right, right?
Yeah. Forward, yeah.
Forward,
Forward
back.
is the right.
Okay,
Right,
great.
right.
April, I just want to say thank you for such an amazing lunch. I was getting hungry, so thank you so much. So it's really a privilege to be here. I've known John for a long time. I've known a lot about the work from the folks on the stage, and I'm really excited to talk about this. So just a little bit of background. I do quite a bit of work at Johns Hopkins in a couple of different programs. One is called the Science of Learning Institute, and that's a relatively new institute at Hopkins that's really looking at translational research, research to practice in education. And there's a number of places around the country that are doing some interesting work. I think Hopkins is really looking from molecular through cognitive psychology into the classroom and informal learning. So a lot of the work that you'll see here today from me really comes from some of that. I'm also working on another program at Hopkins that I think has great relevance, and I've heard it from everybody here today about environment. So there's a new initiative called the Neuroaesthetics Initiative, and that initiative is looking at environment and space, and how environment and space affects well-being, the ability to learn, sort of health and wellness. And so a lot of the work that I'm going to show you today also has environment as a real key to growth. So, we talked a little bit about the neuroplasticity, and thank God that it's never too late. I think that's the big take home for neuroplasticity. I do a lot of work. Over the last 30 years, I've worked with children birth to 15. And increasingly, I keep going down market. So now most of my work is primarily with children birth to 5 years old. And that's because it's really where the action is. If you're going to make a difference in the outcomes of children, starting very, very early just matters. And I think that I'm preaching to the converted here, but just a couple of things that I think are really interesting. And I do a lot of work with parents and educators, and what I find is that they don't know that young children really are born learning. That in fact, most people, and there's some interesting research around this recently, most folks think that when children go to school, they're ready to start learning. What happens before that, and that could be anywhere from 4 to 6, is that they're just playing and they're taking care of their physical needs, but they're not actually learning. So we know that a young child's brain doubles in the first year. We know that vocabulary quadruples in between the first and second year, and that by the time that they're 3 years old, 80% of their brain is developed. We also know in that birth to 3 period that neuropruning is taking place. So if those neurons, those 100 billion neurons, aren't being activated, they are pruning, and they're pruning at a very rapid pace. And so that's really critical. So things like language and vocabulary, motor skill development, socialization, building in relationships, all of those things are so important. And we know that from science, how that gets translated into practice, both informal and formal learning, takes lots of different shapes. I think Bruce talked a lot about IQ and thinking about, working memory. And working memory is certainly a very, very important skill, as is focus. What we're seeing with early childhood is that children that have emotional quotients, that really understand the social emotional world, and also a curiosity quotient, the ability, the desire to seek information, to be knowledge-driven, to want to know more. Children that have both the emotional and the curiosity quotient in gear do better long-term than kids that are looking at IQ alone. Working memory is what's tested most often. You hear a lot about working memory, and it's super important, but in combination. So it's not either my child has great IQ or they have the social emotional curiosity sort of capacity. It's in combination. So for young children, they're primed to be learning all of that. So I think a lot of the programs that I've worked on certainly recognize attention and focus and prefrontal cortex, but also really think about these other sort of evolutionary drivers. So why does this matter? We've talked a little bit about neuroplasticity. I think, if anything, my connection, my link here is neurons to neighborhoods. It matters in the community. Children that do not have early childhood programs are 25% less likely to graduate from high school. We were talking about these third grade reading and math tests. These are the same tests that predict how we're going to build our prisons. And so the likelihood of not being proficient in math and reading when you're in third grade has huge implications for outcomes. The ability to be able to learn to read goes all the way back to birth, when a mom is making faces, is mimicking sound, is mirroring play, is looking at more vocabulary. We also know that in the early childhood space, only 3 of 10 programs in the country would be seen as high quality. And there's lots of definitions for what quality means, but mostly the programs that are in place are really taking care of kids, but they're not actually teaching young children how to build these more complex cognitive and social emotional skills. And also from a sort of financial return, we know that for every dollar spent on early learning that's spent well, we think that it's between $7 and $10 return, and that's in not having a child go to prison and not being in some kind of entitlement system, and being able to look at getting jobs. So the returns, James Heckman is the economist that did quite a bit of work in this, and he's continuing to look at it and seeing that there's a lot more social implications and societal impact on the ability to be able to look at this early child care and child learning, birth to 5 in particular. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think John's going to talk more about it as a team, but components of great programs for early learning really fall into 4 categories. One is research to practice. What do we know on the bench? What do we know in cognition? And how does that come into play? And how does that iterate? And how does that design change as we come into the field, we bring it back, and we learn and grow? And we've heard some examples of some of the evidence-based stuff here today. Dynamic markets. Technology is screens are what are really driving a lot of things in education. The ability to be anywhere, anytime is really critical. Looking at the way we think about data, how we link these programs with state, Head Start, private providers, looking at the continuum, not birth to 2 or 2 to 4, but looking at that whole continuum. So each year really builds on the other. And we're seeing bilingualism to be absolutely essential, and dual language learning as being a very, very important part of the way the marketplace, and I'm talking now about the United States, is really developing. I'm doing a lot of work all over the world now, and we're actually seeing early learning rise in China, in Singapore, in Latin America, because as affluence and development is happening in those countries, children are having more anxiety, there's more stress, there's more issues with language acquisition. So it's actually really interesting to see how early learning is what's happening around the world. High family needs is another sort of critical piece. This home to school connection, the idea of parents being the child's first learner being very important, but also helping parents understand the research and using the research in very practical ways. And then last, from a workforce perspective, it's all over the place. It's a very fragmented market. Professional development is really difficult. The average amount that a child care provider makes is $7.50 an hour, which is crazy. And so when you think about employment issues within child care and early learning, it's really quite extraordinary. And National Academy of Sciences recently did a study looking at this, making some recommendations, and it's really a 10-year lift to try to really think about workforce, much like the way we looked at nursing in the 70s. A couple of things in terms of approach, looking at this brain development piece around relationships, around healthy, nurturing environments, really looking at practice and skill development, both from a cognitive point of view, but also from a social and emotional point of view, and building that together in a comprehensive program that is really blended. So on and offline learning, I think, is the takeaway there. And I'm just going to spend a couple minutes just showing you some examples of some programs that have scaled, are working really efficiently, and are really taking into consideration the sort of core components of a program. So on the right is Mind in the Making, and Mind in the Making is a program that was developed by Ellen Golinsky. Fantastic program, has videotaped and interviewed researchers in the world of development over the last 20 years. There's about 85 and growing videos that you can look at that really show the research to practice. And now that program is doing workshops all over the world with educators and parents, really helping them understand the research around what young children need. That has morphed into a program with the Bezos Family Foundation called Vroom. And Vroom is a program that reaches out to parents, that shows them in very practical, easy tips how you can do things with your child in the moment to really make a difference. And they're working with a lot of high needs communities, but they're working with communities at any economic level, because a lot of this information is belief and value based. So while it's important to work with high needs families, it's really very important for lots of families. At the top is Curiosityville characters. That's Pablo, Ruby, Joe, Rosie, Jack, and Olive. And they were built for learning. They're characters that are part of a company I built called Curiosityville that was acquired by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, who also drives Curious George and other properties. And what we know are these character-based programs are highly sticky and very much something that young children learn through mentorship and partnership and relationships. So we built a number of programs that really look at high sticky characters as relationship, as mentors for teaching all of these learning areas in social emotional development and content areas, and also health and physical development. Curious George, I think, is a really great example of that. And then just as an example of one other, well, I'll show two other programs. One is a program called the Ultimate Block Party, which was a rogue group of researchers and advocates that got together a couple years ago and said, you know, we need to show how play and learning work together. We thought we'd have a couple thousand people come to an event in Central Park. 75,000 people showed up, and it has continued, I know. And so we've done 4 around the country, and now the Association of Children's Museums is taking the Ultimate Block Party on the road, and every children's museum will have this around the country and ultimately around the world. And then the last one that I want to tell you about, and again, I want to point out that these are all programs that have scaled. And so there's thousands of islands of excellence, but the ability to be able to connect them and to build them out so there's a network that's highly, that has efficacy and fidelity and can actually scale in any community, I think is a really important piece. So the last one I'll tell you about is Too Small to Fail. So Too Small to Fail is part of the Clinton Global Initiative, and they got together with Head Start and the Family Child Care Provider Association. 30% of children in this country are in either Head Start or family child care providers, and that's the mom at the end of the corner who takes your child while you go to school. So they don't know so much about early learning, but they're loving and caring and want to be there. Head Start, same thing. They've actually created a 5-week, it's called a boot camp. It's called High Five, and they deliver competency-based programs in child development, in parent engagement, and things that you can do with the children that are in your program over videos within a 5-week series. And they've had tremendous lifts in quality and evaluation from parents and child care providers through something as simple as a very focused intervention on that primary child care provider. So let me stop there. I'm excited to hear more. Thank you. Faster when I'm running out of time.
Oh, do you have that?
It's up there.
Okay. Hi, everybody. What we're going to share about MindUP right now, let's see, is what Goldie created with a group of neuroscientists, educators, contemplative practitioners, and positive psychologists. It took about 3 years to write the program. It took another 6 to get it researched in an RCT. It took another 2 to get it accredited by CASEL. And today we've recently hit our 500,000 kids served mark in 7 countries and are trying to scale through one of the hardest systems in the country, our US education system. So we have some great anecdotal things to share with you. So one of the things that makes MindUP different is really its brain-centric approach. You're going to see a little bit more about our pillars in a sec, but one of the things that I think bookend our program is we believe that mindfulness is terrific. Mindfulness is one of our pillars, but we think it needs to be bookended by an understanding of our brain on the left and some positive psychology on the right for an outcome of social and emotional literacy. That's been a formula that's been very successful for us. Susan talked about sticky, things that the young kids, because our program serves from pre-K through 12, really can relate to and anchor to, that helps with academic attainment, general well-being, behavioral, issues in the classroom and at home. So I don't need to tell any of you about the state of kids and teachers today, stress and schools. Kids are arriving to school with no capacity to quiet their mind. They don't have the coping mechanisms to be able to get quiet and engage in learning. So one of the things that we started doing and looking at the research around the country, and I think 2 of the most disturbing statistics that we kind of fuels us on an everyday basis and our mission is 50% of the kids lack hope for the future. Well, we can talk about motivation, we can talk about academic attainment, et cetera, but if 50% lack hope for the future, I think that's a huge statement about what we're doing in our school system and how we can hopefully make it better. The other thing is nearly 1 in 3 kids are bullied. and that statistic is growing. And whether, as Susan, I think, very accurately pointed out, whether we're talking about the at-risk kids and kids that are experiencing ACEs, chronic stress, et cetera, or we're really talking about kids that come out of environments that don't have maybe an obvious stress or pressure, but are actually showing up in sometimes worse shape with overscheduled agendas, psychosomatic illness, and incredible levels of stress on the other end. These are programs that can scale equitably across all socioeconomic spectrums. So the state of our kids really helps fuel what we're doing with this. And what MindUP attempts to do through 15 lessons and an evidence-based initiative is to focus on well-being and resiliency. Originally, we were considered a curriculum with some motivational workshops, some digital learning, et cetera. Now we're really talking about pro-social behavior, positive youth development, how do we look at academic attainment, self-management, and infuse these things into how we learn, why we learn, and what we can do. So around our 4 pillars, we look at research and outcomes, we look at the domains, as we said, of neuroscience, mindful awareness training, and positive psych. We have a 15-lesson framework that looks something like this, but it always starts with how our brain works. And it's interesting because even kids as little as 3 and 4 years old have a fundamental understanding, and we're going to show you how we teach that to them, of why they're feeling what they're feeling. And as Dan Siegel, who many of you know wrote the Brainstorm and the MindSight, et cetera, does, he taught us a little hand model that even the youngest of us can understand and communicate with a teacher instead of shutting down the learning process, turning it into a behavioral disruption, on how I flip out. Here's their amygdala, here's their prefrontal cortex, they fold it over, and when they're ready to flip their lid, they have nonverbal communication to say, I need some help, I need a mindful moment, I need a brain break. Our brain breaks are basically 2 to 3 minute deep breathing exercises that are the core practice of the program. They're introduced 3 times a day. Starting in the morning, typically teachers will use them for a sense of welcome and transition to get them ready and engaged in learning. They're used after lunch or recess to get them engaged, re-engaged, I should say, in learning. And oftentimes, because of the testing culture that's been developed in schools today, they're used to quell anxiety before quizzes and tests and things of that nature. When we go to implement in a school system, and right now we still do the individual site, or we are working across examples like in Reno, Nevada, we're doing 93 schools and going district-wide, and everything in between. But it starts out with professional development, because what we've learned is how can the ethos of self-care come into the schools? And the answer is really through the teachers, through the guidance counselors, through the support personnel, in the environment, and to focus on the environment and how it's created. We offer a digital learning component so they can access 24/7 resources, videos, teacher tips, and best practice share, get questions answered. We look at implementation 90 days in. We don't wait till the end of the year to see if it's working. We go right back in and say, what can we do? How is it? Are your teachers embracing it? Is the community embracing it? And at that point, we add the parent piece. We want the teachers to have 90 days to play with it, get comfortable with it, because MindUP isn't an add-on. It's not another thing to do. In fact, in our workshop, we answer the question in the first 5 minutes pretty strategically, what's in it for them? Because most of our teachers, our guidance counselors, our therapists, and the support personnel in the schools cannot take on one more thing. So we answer how that's going to actually save them time and what it'll do for them pretty quickly. And then we stay committed with them through evaluation processes, pre, midterm, and post, through a community engagement piece, through parent workshops, and finally to work on school climate. What is the kind of environment that we can create where kids are empathic, they're using compassion, they're really pro-social in their attempts with each other? So in one of our workshops, we start out with who's in charge, you or your brain? That's a compelling question. It's one that the teachers have a lot of fun with. And we focus on these 3 areas of the brain for our pre-K through 8 program. We just piloted high school where we add the cerebellum, the limbic system, and some other pieces, risk versus reward. But for the younger ones, we focus on the PFC, and we use characters as well, and we think of that as our wise old owl. We look at the hippocampus for memory. We do a big pink happy hippo dancing down memory lane. And for our amygdala, how we explain fight, flight, or freeze in our emotional hub of the brain is with a barking English bulldog, who at times can be deliciously lovable and cute, and at times is flipping out and pretty fierce. And as many of you saw earlier with Harry, Phineas Gage is a great one for all of us to learn about. The teachers love it. But one of the things we do in our PD program is really take them through an interactive experience of how they will take this back to the classroom and activate it instantly so they leave with tangible things. Even the counselors will go into a therapeutic model and design how will they bring it in if it's coming in through the counseling process. And so we have asked them to create a metaphor, create rap songs, do poems, do pictures, whatever they think is going to be a resonant way to teach the kids. And I want to show you an example that happened a couple weeks ago in Baltimore, where if we consider the impact of these kinds of soft skills and character development, and this not being one more thing to do in an add-on, the interesting piece here is what a math teacher named Jason Eccles did, a math teacher, who decided to turn this into a social commentary around what was happening in his community and Black Lives Matter. So we were astounded at his brain lesson and his take on how to teach the brain amazingly creatively. So Joe, I'm going to ask for your help because he's upside down again. Oh, and one more thing. Can we stop it 1 sec? Notice one thing. For all of you who've gone into a teaching environment, especially in a troubled school in the middle of the projects with teachers who have probably had 50% attrition in the last couple of years, the teachers are standing with their arms crossed just like this, and you're coming in going, here we go. One more thing I have to do, one more group who has something better, to do.
One more professional development.
One more PD program.
I wish I could be at the movies.
Exactly. So one of the things I want, that we found equally interesting about what he did is the amount of team building and cohort building and practice building that was going on around this in an interactive way. So now, Joe, will you play it?
All right, ready? Amygdala, you are a friend to moi. You keep me safe at all costs. Like Tony Danza, you're the boss.
Bars.
Red and yellow. Because of you, I react like the man in red and yellow. That's the Flash, if you didn't get it. I react in the Flash. Yes. Haters have a PhD. You block and regulate my PFC. Hold up. The only problem with you is sometimes you react like those boys in blue. Can't tell the real from the fake. Might end up making a mistake. If I keep you in check, I can handle the latter. So what I'm trying to say is, all Black Lives Matter.
That's an example of how he taught his brain lesson and how he was going to go back and have a fundamental understanding of the amygdala, the PFC, and the hippocampus. Hopefully with a little bit more on the end, but a good example nonetheless. So in order for us to scale and replicate at scale with fidelity, we map to other initiatives. We understand Common Core is a big challenge for them. We've mapped against it. We map against other programs very collaboratively so the schools don't have to go through brain surgery to figure out what to do. We align it to curriculum. We use our core practice as a framework. And in all of the cases, we believe that brain science can be taught in every subject, in every grade level, and be the basis for learning for the kids to have a fundamental understanding. And then we look at transformation. Basically, how do we change the classroom? What do we bring to teachers around the ethos of self-care? How do we infuse this in our kids so they have a happy, whole opportunity later in life and can not only survive, but thrive? And I think there's our fearless leader, Goldie Hawn, with some of the kids. So thanks.
Wow. So you can see why I was excited to be a part of this panel. Kim, let's stick with you for a minute because entering public education where you actually get a program integrated into a school or district is extremely hard because you have all the behavioral change of, there are a lot of policies around what's called seat time, which is you have to have the kids learning content a certain part of the day to be compliant with state standards. And then teachers are already overwhelmed with so many other requirements they're being asked to do. So can you just explain to the group how you came to understand that to make this program successful, it couldn't be curriculum really, it had to be school culture and it had to be embraced. And literally the teachers had to make this their own, which we saw in that video.
I think we all know that curriculum is nowadays going to sit on the shelf. 200 binders, 3,000 rules, this is what you have to do. And the teachers just aren't willing to do it anymore. They're pushing back, and we have inside schools really a very broken situation. So what we do is when we want to go into a community or a community has asked us and invited us to come in, we do a top-down, bottom-up approach. We start doing some meetings with the teachers so they understand completely how this will save them time, how behavioral disruptions diminish, what's in it for the kids and them in terms of academic attainment. Because as an evidence-based program, we have the stats and statistics to look at what happened to executive function, what happened to inhibitory response, how did prosocial behavior increase, math scores going up 15%. So we prove premise on the evidence base. We pull a lot of research from all the universities that are, looking at this stuff all the time. We also, from the top down, work on the district level to talk about community, to talk about impact, and use a community engagement piece to scaffold a network of support for these schools. Most of the time, and I think on a national survey, the number was something like 95% of educators believe that these kind of skill sets, the soft skills that we no longer really teach, are critical to who they become as a human being, a learner. They're the same skills you need for innovation, collaboration, as Bruce and Susan talked about later in life. So for us, it's top down, bottom up. It's trying to get the word out about these kinds of programs. And then once we're invited in, to really make it easy and make it a framework. So we consider MindUP a framework that seamlessly goes into therapeutic models. We're working with healthcare centers in addition to schools. It goes into workforce pretty easily. And in the school system, we come in typically through the educators, but at times it's the mental health piece or the guidance counselor that will introduce it as a potential remedy or option to align with.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do a follow-up question. And it's along the lines, I think any of you could, I would encourage you to respond, but public education goes through these kind of policy phases. We had No Child Left Behind. It was all about testing. You got to show the numbers at the district level. Now we've gone to Common Core, which is more about creating 21st century learners. Initial returns in on this are that it's a very challenging program to implement. But it all goes to the point, what I think all three of you are talking about is we have to shift our orientation around how we measure success and where we want our resources to go, much more towards whole child. And yet when you look at these other standards, this is always the exception. How are we going to make that change?
I'll start because this is a funny story. I was at a meeting with a number of deans from schools of education. And I was talking about all of this brain work. And this one guy stood up, and I won't say his name, and he said, "What does the brain have to do with learning?" And so, if you think about that the schools of education that are teaching educators in this country don't see the connection between how the brain works and what happens, but rather it's the loudest pedagogy, it's the loudest voice that actually becomes, whatever the next big pedagogy sort of fad is going to be. I think that makes a big difference. And why I've been so drawn to evidence-based is that in many ways, science is the closest thing we have to truth. And truth is very hard to get at. But when you really look at the body of basic science, cognitive science, psychology, over time. It's not always right, it gets it wrong, but it seeks to understand these very basic principles that you can build on, that you can translate. It's highly messy, it's highly interdisciplinary, but I think, like when you talk about soft skills, I hate that term because it implies that it's not necessary. In fact, it's the bedrock skills, and we are such a reactionary country, so too small to fail happened when the Bush administration saw that we didn't look so good on the PISA skills. So it was like, what's the reaction to that as opposed to the prevention? And I think neuroscience is bipartisan. It helps to really allow us to have conversations that are not so charged and give us a baseline. So,
And I'd like to add to that, you're right. The neuroscience piece leads the day for us. We're the only program in the country right now that is both an evidence-based mindfulness program and SEL with the neuroscience piece in it. And it eliminates any barrier to entry. When we go in talking about mindfulness, even though it's a revolution and we all think it's fantastic, there are times that depending on the area or region you're working in, it doesn't fly.
it's too touchy-feely, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they draw extensions to things that really have nothing to do.
Right.
So anyway.
So I'm going to turn to you, Bruce, because here you have this program. It's a cognitive gaming platform. And to your point, Susan, you said, in good science, there's evidence which will reveal the truth. So you're getting these pretty astounding results. And are there any educators in the room, teachers?
Deans?
Because moving test scores is hard. It's really hard. And yet you had statistically pretty extraordinary results. So when you present that to educators, what's their reaction?
Well, we often get an immediate reaction that this is very impressive. But then when you go to the next step of what they're actually going to implement, you run into all sorts of problems. And our program takes a lot of curricular time. I mean, we're talking about 3 times a week for at least a half hour or 45 minutes by the time you walk kids to the computer lab and you have them log on, and then we have a physical education component. So it's a big curricular commitment. So we have presented results to the school system, their own results, these results, and at the assistant superintendent level, they see this looks really good. But most of the schools are not setting their program at the central office anymore. They're giving more and more autonomy down the chain. Well, the principals look, oh, this looks pretty good also, but I got to check with my teachers. And then the teachers, when you get there, it starts to get more subjective. Well, I didn't really see much in my classroom. Well, here are the test scores. No, but I didn't really see a big change in my classroom, and it took a whole lot of time. And then you get down to the kids, and the kids look at our games, and they're playing them, and we do our best to make them engaging. But some of them will say, well, this isn't like the entertainment games I play at home. So we're competing at each of those levels. And the entertainment games, earlier in the conference, some people made the point, correctly, I think, that not all games are the same. Other people have been lumping them together and giving a lecture about computer games and what it does. They're hugely different. And the entertainment games are very different from brain training education games. They're created for a different purpose. They're created to entertain, and their purpose, their goal, commercially, is to get the kids to want to play them over and over again. They're good at it, and they actually engage parts of the brain that we don't think should be engaged, and they bypass the frontal executive systems that need to be engaged. Kids with ADHD can play those entertainment games for hours. So it's not challenging their deficits, but it's also not fixing them. They then go to school, so we don't want to make a computer game that looks like the entertainment games, yet the kids come with an expectation because that's out there. So we're competing at all these levels. And I think the reason, your first question, how do we get into the schools? I think it's going to be a gradual process, and we have to bring along more and more people at each of the levels. We need to bring more private investors along. The schools have a bad reputation in terms for investors. Education space is not a place we want to go into. We got hurt once in the education space. And so that hurts the schools because of their own reputation. And then we have to move down the chain now. First, we have to get evidence for the high part of the chain, decision-making chain, that it works. But now we got to move down to show the teachers what you said, that this is going to make your job easier. So we're figuring out how to translate this so teachers will want it. And then we got to work up from the kids' side to make the games more entertainment.
And I think one of the things to add to that, these are skills that can be integrated into any kind of college environment for pre-service teacher training, pre-service health provider training, etc.
Oh, and the teachers' colleges, you're right.
Absolutely.
That's a place where they should be
It's a
teaching this
framework
too.
that
Yeah.
could be skills that are easily brought in without having to be the add-on. You know?
You know, I'll just make one comment. I think it will be, some programs like what MindUP is designed, you have 500,000 students and teachers, which is extraordinary. How many years has it been?
13.
Okay, but that is getting to scale for real positive impact in the world. I do think this whole understanding of our brain as part of ourselves, where we're going through a shift to where we see it as something you can have a different relationship with. And if physical fitness and cognitive fitness become kind of one big construct, that will open the door for, I think, schools to be much more comfortable with these programs. So I have time for one other question, and I'm going to pose it to Susan. Susan, if you could go see the President of the United States, the next president, which you probably will because of your role in education, if you had one recommendation to make based on your body of work for our country, what would it be?
It would be very, very simple. Fund birth to 5 consistently at a federal level, which is currently not happening. And so, like, healthcare is a right in this country. Early learning is not a right; it's a privilege, and it's very inconsistent. And so, to be able to have the resources to be able to build out these kinds of evidence-based programs in early learning, I think, would change the trajectory of every child.
Let's end on that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.